So welcome to this year's MRS Mobile Optimization Webinar 2023. My name is Deborah Harding and I'm Managing Director of the Market Research Society, and I'll be here chairing today's session to talk about our mobile optimization research. Before we get into the content, just a few housekeeping rules. So the webinar today will last an hour and 15 minutes. The presentations themselves will probably last about 45 minutes, leaving us at least half an hour to have a panel discussion at the end. We really welcome questions from you, so please do put any questions you might have in the Q&A, and we will then put those questions to the panel at the end. If you are interested in sharing this webinar with other colleagues, it is being recorded. So the recording for the webinar should be available in about a week or so's time. It will be available on the mobile optimization pages of the MRS website, where you can also find the recordings from previous years and all of the information that supports this very important project. So let's get into the detail. So what we've done, this project was launched in 2018 and has been an unprecedented collaborative effort between MRS and 4 panel provision organisations, Dynata, Kantar, Toluna and Cint. There are 2 areas of research which we have focused on. One is response trends, which is looking at secondary data aggregated from the 4 panel suppliers and looking at the response patterns by devices, age and country. The core markets of the UK, US, China, Australia, France, Germany and Brazil have been covered from the beginning of the project. In 2021, we also added Canada, the Netherlands and Japan. And in 2022, we added India, Indonesia and South Africa. The second part of the project is some primary research that's been collected across all 4 panel suppliers. And this is topical research investigating the different themes relevant for research best practice and how they're impacted in mobile research. And today's presentation will in effect take both of these elements of the research, firstly looking at the response trends and then the topical research, and then we will have the Q&A panel discussion at the end. As I say, I will be chairing this today, and I have got a fantastic range of very experienced and knowledgeable speakers who will be presenting today. We have Glyn Brimage, who's Head of Operations Transformation at Kantar, Martina Galantucci, who is the Director, Customer Optimization for EMEA for Cint, Maria Hans, who is the Vice President, Online Data Quality at Toluna, and Keith Phillips, who is Director of Research Science at Dynata. I'm sure you'll agree, a fantastic lineup of speakers. So I'm now going to hand over to Keith and Glyn, who are going to take us through this year's response trends. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Deborah. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Over the next few slides, I'll be going over what we have observed from the latest research when it comes to the starts and completes on PC desktop and phones. The first thing to note here is in 2022, for the first time, we are seeing that phone starts and completes at a higher level than PC and desktop, which shows some fantastic progress that has been made during 2022 to allow participation on all devices and taking into account research design to allow all device types. However, one thing to note, with this great progress, which we have seen, what we do observe is that this is not compatible in terms of what we see with the device preference data. So when we look at device preference data, what we're seeing is that in some tier 1 markets, people are joining panels or looking to participate at around about a 70% plus range. In tier 2, it's actually higher, about 80% plus. So when we see phone starts that are around 50%, mid 50% range, it suggests that there are still things that we need to work on when it comes to device controls or design constraints, which are affecting the respondent experience and resulting in people having to switch to other devices to be able to participate in surveys. If you can move forward to the next slide, please. What we are seeing here is we are seeing across the markets that we're looking at, we are still seeing continued growth, and which is showing progress across most markets. And in fact, the year-on-year growth is slightly down on what we saw previously, which was up at about 8%. What we're seeing is that in emerging markets, phone starts are remaining high and growing, and this illustrates further the importance of good design as the work continues to transition from what has traditionally been more of an offline to online in these markets. What we are seeing is that there is some slowing growth in certain markets, and most notably, we've seen this in Japan and Netherlands in the latest research. Some of the reasons for this could be, for example, demographic composition in markets like Japan, where we know there is a higher proportion of older people who are maybe more likely or have a higher preference to use a PC desktop device. The slower growth could also indicate that there are types of work or even potentially tenure implications when we look at this. So, for example, in markets where we see slowing, is that because the work that is easier to transition has been tackled, whereas the work that is more difficult, such as longitudinal tracking type work, that takes more time to be able to make the changes necessary because of the consistency considerations. The other thing, as I mentioned around tenure, is that we observe that people tend to trit off panels more quickly, tend to be those who are shorter tenure. And these are more likely to be people who are on the phone, which will impact the progress that we can see on the phone starts completes. Whereas more tenured people are possibly more inclined to be using a PC desktop for taking surveys or have been conditioned to take surveys on a PC desktop. Last thing to just note on here is that Australia shows the same year-on-year growth and is one of the markets with the highest growth, but still has very low phone starts, which is something we do need to look into further to understand what might be driving that. If you can move forward to slide 3, please. As we start to look at the starts to complete conversion, what we can see here is that it is very close to what we observe on PC desktop, which is good to see. We're also seeing some really good progress in China, which is pleasing to see. Complete conversion rate is up 11%. Other markets were still seeing good growth, but it's around about half of what we've seen in China. Going back to the last point I made on the previous slide, Australia had the best performance in starts to complete conversion in terms of what we've seen year on year. So this in terms of what we see versus what's happened with the PC desktop as well. So what this indicates is that when you look at it suggests that there may be issues more in relation to the devices that people are allowed, or any capping on devices that may be occurring, as opposed to there being an issue with design and people being able to participate and complete a survey when they're on a phone device. Where we see lower completes in more established markets and where we see a difference between the phone completes versus starts dropping, there is a risk that design or device restrictions is going to start to impact upon things like sustainability and representativity in markets, in particular where we have a high phone usage and based on device preference information that we have when you start to look at this by age group. The last thing I just wanted to mention on this slide before handing over to Keith is designing surveys that accommodate all devices is key, in understanding any things that could inhibit that is really important for researchers. So are there any technical constraints or other issues that may limit participation on a phone? And these are things that we really need to try and understand. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Keith, who's going to take you into a bit more of the detail on this.
Thank you. Ready for the next slide, please. So let's take a moment to look at the demographics that we're seeing in the traffic. As Glenn mentioned, we're at a place where more than half of the traffic we see today comes in on a mobile device. That's actually true now for every single age cohort except for the 60+ group. You'll notice there's a skew towards females. That's something we've seen in years past, where females prefer mobile more so than males. But it's the age correlation that we expect to be strong and is really strong. The thing that's interesting to me is the year-over-year increase that we see in terms of mobile traffic. It's still, a very strong lift, even among the 18 to 24 and 25 to 29 groups that already have really high usage of mobile. So this indicates that we would expect this trend to continue again next year, right? We're not done yet with how many mobile starts we're going to see in terms of growth. And what this makes you think about is actual practical concerns when you think about feasibility. So the 18 to 24-year-olds, for example, that's one of the harder to reach audiences depending on the market. If you, for whatever reason, couldn't get your survey into a mobile-friendly mode, then you could potentially you would be very challenged feasibility-wise with that group. Not to mention, what this would do to your faith in the data, right? Like where at that moment we'd be excluding a large portion of the sample frame. Now, on the flip side of that, if we had a mobile-only approach, we might have similar concerns about the 60+ group. So this really tells us, sends the message that we need to always take a device agnostic approach, try to design our research in a way where people can come in based on their device preference. And that's really the best way. Next, we'll take a look at conversion. So Glenn mentioned this a little bit as well, and this is really something we look at when we're considering sort of the health of the mobile traffic, comparing the starts we're seeing to the completes we're seeing over time, because that should be aligned. And here, if we go back to 2016, looking at the bottom two lines, we have the purple line, second from the bottom. We're looking at all the starts coming through traffic. And then the blue line at the very bottom, we're looking at all the completes. Sizable gap back in 2016. That gap has narrowed. And for the last couple of years, we've only been, a percentage point or so behind where we want to be. So that just speaks to the improvements that have been made and us as an industry moving in the right direction. However, that gap exists because of what's going on with the 18 to 24-year-olds. So if you look at the starts among 18 to 24-year-olds, that's the very top line in yellow, and then the completes in green underneath that. There was an even larger gap back in 2016. That gap has also narrowed. Where we stand today, we have among 18 to 24-year-olds, 73% of the starts come via mobile, and only 70% of the completes are coming via mobile. So that's 3 percentage point gap. For those of us who are used to dealing with samples, doesn't seem large, but this is not a sample in a traditional sense. We're looking at a sample of 4 companies in the industry, but we're looking across all of the traffic. So we're looking at millions of records. So that 3 percentage point gap is still meaningful and is still an indication that we want to get to a better place in terms of the mobile experience. Now, why is it, the gap exists among 18 and 24-year-olds and not necessarily among other age cohorts? Is interesting to think about. Certainly there's unique research targeted towards that group, but overall you would expect similar surveys and similar experiences. And so perhaps I would hypothesize maybe their expectation for mobile is a little higher. They might be a little bit more impatient. So those are the things we're dealing with, but it is particular to that age cohort that they're more likely to not complete. Now, why are they not completing? Well, on the next slide, we'll take a look at the incomplete rates, right? So what we mean here is I kind of refer to these as drops myself, but by incomplete, we basically mean somebody just stopping and leaving the survey in the middle of it, right? I don't want to complete it, I'm just going to go. And that's what really drives that difference between the mobile starts we see and the mobile completes. Here, if we look at India, for an example, on the top line in green, we see 81% starts coming via phone. And we see, if we look at the universe of the incompletes, 83% of them are on a phone. So there's that 2 percentage point gap. It's not large. Certainly it varies by different, by country. But what's interesting to me is that the gap exists in every single country, right? And that's the case, even though these countries, they'll be tracking work that goes across country, but there's also unique work in every one of the countries. And so this kind of speaks to the challenge that we have with with the device and as an industry to sort of improve the experience. And so why do people drop? And if we go to the next slide, we have sort of an example here. Now, Perhaps a few of you have, television sized monitors and you can maybe read that image to the right, but it should be rendering as a similar size to a smartphone. And if it is that size, you're probably really struggling to read those answer choices. Certainly, this is not the norm today, but this still exists today. And what would you do to read this question? You'd have to sort of pinch and narrow in, and that's going to be a really tedious process. Now, in the next section, we're going to talk a little about the experiments and sort of what impact it could have on data if you're not mobile friendly design, but thinking about just the experience of the user and how this will impact their future behavior. I think Glenn mentioned we see a lot more enthusiasm to join panels on mobile, and then it doesn't continue. So if this is your experience, you're going to be less likely to come back on this device and perhaps less likely to take another survey on the panel. And so with that, I think I'll allow others to sort of react.
Thank you very much, Keith and Glyn. That was a great start to the mobile optimizations dilemma. Martina and Marie, before we go into the topical research, what reflections do you take from what you've just heard in terms of this year's data? Why don't we start, Martina, with you first?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's great to see that there's been, a big change, lots of progress on, awareness on mobile optimization needs. All the work that we've done has definitely had an impact. What I find really interesting is about mobile conversion in different age groups. Would be good to kind of investigate what makes younger age groups drop out compared to other older age groups. Is it linked to higher expectation, as we said, or a different profiling altogether? And considering the lower conversion, I think this is a key question to answer, and maybe something we can look at in the future, because we are missing out of a chunk of respondents which are already hard to reach. But dropouts are still very high overall, it seems. So is there a chunk of population we just cannot capture because of poor design? I'm wondering if part of it is also that people on mobile are taking surveys whilst traveling, maybe in between gaps, in between other activities whilst they're browsing, and so they just decide to drop off when they reach destination. There's a lot that we can still investigate, but all in all, it's great to see the progress.
And Marie, what are your thoughts on seeing this year's data?
Yeah, same. I agree. The progress is really great to see. And building on what Martina has said, I think that conversion gap is really interesting, because it does just remind us that when people are taking surveys and they're participating, we compete for their attention with other things that they could be doing, right? So if they don't have a good time, if they're not enjoying themselves, they don't have a good experience, they are very easily just dropping out and doing something else instead, because we are competing, especially now, thinking about all of the other apps that people have at their fingertips, literally, whether that be videos or social media or other kinds of activities. We're constantly competing for that attention. So if we lose a little bit of engagement, that may actually lead to someone dropping out. And that then ties into something that Keith said earlier, which I think is quite interesting to think about, is who are the people that are dropping out of research? And it's more importantly, who are the people who remain in a survey? So if we look at that example that Keith shared, that's very difficult to see. You have to be quite be quite resilient and zoom in and do quite a lot of activities to just see and read the text. Who are those people that remain versus who are the ones that would drop out in a scenario like that? So there's not just the feasibility aspect of it, of actually being able to reach and complete the target groups that we're looking for in our studies, but there's also the aspect of any kind of underlying skew that may be introduced just based on which devices the survey is available on and how it is designed on those devices, and what that means for the people who actually follow through and complete the survey at the end of the day.
Very good points. Well, that I think leads very nicely on to the next part of the webinar, which is to look at the topical research. And Martina and Marie are going to take us through that. So again, over to you for the topical research.
Thank you, Deborah. So as anticipated, in addition to the response rate data analysis, we've also been running a survey as part of this project to try and answer some key questions around mobile optimization. The objectives of this survey are understanding device preference for taking surveys, exploring the impact, if any, that the choice of device can potentially have on data quality. Now, we need to take into account that data quality is a much bigger topic, effectively a very hot topic at the moment in the industry. And surely it's not just strictly related to survey design alone. We have a variety of factors playing a part, but definitely something to consider. And the third objective is to measure the impact of survey design on completion rate, as well as respondents' experience and how survey design plays a major role in panelist satisfaction and ultimately retention rate. By running this survey, we were hoping to answer two key research questions. And those were, what device should surveys be offered on as a standard? And should surveys always be mobile optimized? So next slide, please. So let's have a look quickly at the project spec. We ran the study in 3 markets, UK, US, and Australia, with NatRep quotas on age and gender, plus income and education for monitoring purposes. We collected 1,800 completes per market across the 4 companies, and those completes were split into 3 cells. 1 control cell for desktop and laptop completes, and 2 mobile cells, 1 mobile optimized one and 1 non-optimized one, which I will explain a bit more in detail shortly. In terms of survey design, the questionnaire included 4 sections. So we had demographics, device usage tracking, concept testing, and debrief. And as you might know, this is the 6th year we have been running this project. And every year we sort of try and make some changes to investigate further topics. This year we have made some design changes by flipping the sliding scales options, and check if that made any difference in response behaviors. And we added 3 new questions. So we asked what device they are using to complete the survey and why, where they are taking the survey, so on the go or at home or whilst doing something else, and how long do they think the survey took to complete, so to sort of collect that perception from the panelists. Now let's look at the cells and the survey design in more details. Next slide, please. Right, so as I mentioned, we had 4 sections. The first one includes age and gender, as well as questions about number of surveys taken on an average week, likelihood of taking another survey after this one, and the speed of technology adoption. The second section was all about device usage tracking, so what device they own or have access to, how likely they would replace a certain device should it break, and what device they prefer to use for different tasks, including, of course, surveys and location of taking the current survey. The third section is our concept testing, and that's where each cell goes through a different survey design. For this section, we chose shopping habits as a theme, and picked the 3 main culprits when it comes to mobile optimization. So we had a very long list, the much hated grid, and an image question. And this is also where we inserted an attention check, a trap question, and a series of awareness questions to test the quality of responses. The last section was mainly about survey satisfaction, and how likely they are to take another survey, and record panelists' reaction to poor survey design. And this is also where we ask their perception on survey length. Now let's take a look at cells allocation in the next slide, please. Right, as anticipated, we collected 1,800 completes overall, but the sample was split across 1 mobile cell with 1,200 completes and a control cell for desktop and laptop for a total of 600 completes. As you can see, within the mobile cell, we split respondents into two categories. Half of those went through a mobile optimized version of the concept testing within the survey, and the other half sadly had to endure a not optimized version of the same questions in order to compare their response behaviors. So all respondents went through section 1, 2, and 4, but when it comes to concept testing, they were routed based on what cell they belong to. So this is where the comparison between our mobile cells and our controlled desktop laptop cell comes into play and can give us some answers. Now, before we really start looking into the survey data results, I would like to share some secondary research data that we collated around future device trends and innovation, just to be considered moving forward. When we look at the current state, there are some ongoing macro trends that will continue to have an impact on innovation technology. Trends that have started, I would say, a good decade ago and are still ongoing, such as super fast mobile internet, increasingly inexpensive internet devices connected to the internet. We have around 5.3 billion people connected to the internet nowadays, and 85% of the world population is a smartphone user. Then we have the well-known world of artificial intelligence that has seen an exponential increase in users of digital assistants of all kinds, from Siri to Alexa to all the new ones. And then we have the so-called Internet of Things. So that network of machines connected to each other for data collection, monitoring, decision-making, and so on. And by 2025, we are expecting around 50 billion devices connected to the industrial Internet of Things. Now, in addition to these macro trends, according to a report from Mintel that was released this year, from 2024, we will really start seeing some opposite trends coming up, such as more and more focus on sustainability, human relationships, and the need of human touch. And brands have already they've already started to reset their strategy to account for these new trends. It's also interesting to see how smartphone sales have actually peaked just before COVID. If you look at the graph in the middle of the screen, I know it's a bit small, but hopefully you can see the trend. The sales of smartphones had peaked just before COVID, but are now sort of slowing down, almost flattening. And talking about smartphones, in terms of future trends, we can expect all sorts of new technology, from holographic displays, mobile phones specifically designed for children, displays going even bigger and with higher resolution, more and more foldable phones, and an increase in wearable technology such as smart watches, smart glasses, fitness bracelet, and so on. And of course, the usual smart TVs and games consoles that will stay in the game. However, what's really interesting is that we are seeing an increase in the demand of eco-friendly and refurbished phones that goes hand in hand with the sustainability macro trend that I was talking about. So all to say that in our industry, we should really focus on device agnostic rather than just mobile optimized. And also with bigger screens, sounds like the iPhone 16 Pro is expected to have an almost 7-inch screen. The gap between mobile and desktop when it comes to the overall panelist experience will potentially narrow. So we definitely need to take into account new challenges ahead for online research. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I wanted to draw attention to how the global smartphones market compares to the global PC market and what that might mean for the future. The global smartphone revenue was flat year on year, although we're still seeing quarter-on-quarter growth during 2023. But what's surprising is that the refurbished mobile phones market is growing really fast. It's currently worth just over 5 billion euros in Europe alone, and is expected to reach up to 67 billion globally in 2023, by the end of 2023, which is around the corner. On the flip side, I'm sure it's not surprising that the global PC market revenue has been significantly declining in the last few years, with the biggest drop of minus 18% in Q1 2022. But we have started to see a gentle recovery, and what might be even more surprising is that we're expecting a very strong rebound in 2024, thanks to PC devices that will have AI-enabled settings. I think Lenovo, if they haven't launched it yet, they probably will launch a new device soon. So to conclude, whilst we've seen a consistent decline of desktop respondents year on year, we might see this trend slowing down or maybe changing due to a variety of factors when it comes to future trends. Right, I think it's time to now really dive into our survey findings. Next slide, please. Right, so going back to the sample structure, the idea of having different cells is aimed at answering our first research question, which is what devices should surveys be offered on? And this means tracking how device preferences and usage are evolving and how it will impact future survey accessibility and design requirements. Next slide, please. So this is where the comparison between our mobile cell and our control desktop laptop cell comes into play, and we can give us some more answers. So this slide just to show you, to remind you of the two main categories in the survey. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first question that we have analyzed is the number of devices owned by respondents. And we can clearly see that this is very much stable year on year, at around 3.1 for mobile respondents and 3.3 for desktop respondents, showing that panelists are still very much settled on the same type of devices. We do see a slight increase for both groups on smart TVs and a slight decline in tablets, but it's nothing particularly significant. Next slide, please. And on this slide, we looked at the importance of these devices and how likely would respondents be to replace them should they break. It's clear that mobile phones and TVs are still scoring the highest. As you can see, desktop respondents are still very much loyal to their device of choice, and have a higher score when it comes to replace their desktop or laptop compared to mobile respondents, which is expected, and it's very much in line with last year. What's striking though is that the level, and we saw this last year as well, I think, the level of importance of smartphones in both cells is still very high. So even in the control cell, the majority of respondents would tend to use their desktop or laptop as their preferred device for online activities, are still very likely to replace their smartphone. So what that says is that we know smartphones will continue to be very, very important. But when it comes to the future of desktop and laptop, unless, trends will change, the future is very much unsure. Next slide, please. On this question, we looked at what devices respondents prefer for different activities. And what we found is that respondents tend to stick with their preferred device for most online tasks. For example, mobile respondents tend to use a mobile to complete most online activities, apart from the odd tasks, such as filling out those horrible government forms that take a lot of time, whatever device you use. And desktop respondents use their computer instead. So there's very much a certain level of loyalty to the preferred device, especially for desktop respondents. So desktop respondents really end up choosing that device for all activities, and that includes online surveys too. Next slide, please. So effectively, the answer to our first research question, which is what devices should the survey be offered on, is we should offer surveys on as many devices as possible, and should, every survey should at minimum be optimized for both mobile and desktop, to ensure maximum traffic and conversion rate. I've now spoken for quite a while, so I'm pleased to pass it on to Marie.
Thank you very much, Martina. So, of course, looking at the data that Martina just shared and thinking about the fragmentation of devices, some are small, have smaller screens, some are getting bigger screens, some are mobiles, some are desktops, not even starting to think about, tablets or holographic displays that Martina was talking about. The question for us researchers, of course, is one of practicality and feasibility as much as it is of quality. So what would happen if we launched a survey on a mobile that isn't optimized is a question that is one that we sometimes have to consider. So we decided to research this as part of the topical questionnaire and ask ourselves the question, well, what would happen if we launched a survey that is not mobile optimized, and what kind of impact would that have on the respondent experience, on the quality of our responses, but also on the respondent behavior? So on the next slide, just to illustrate this again, what we're comparing in this part of the data is the mobile optimized group versus the not mobile optimized group. And I'll show some examples in a second of what that looked like. So on the next slide then, we can see the three types of questions that Martina outlined earlier. So one was a optimized versus non-optimized long list question. So on the very left, we can see we made respondents in the non-optimized group very precisely click that very small box next to the option that they wanted to select. Whereas in the optimized scenario, they could just broadly click on the box that the answer was in, and that would select the box. So on a smaller screen, the non-optimized version, is quite a lot of effort to actually hit the option that you want to hit. The non-optimized and optimized grid, we can see in the middle on the left side, we've got the classic grid situation with options across the top and options down the side. We created this in a way that it would not fit on the screen, because we often see those kinds of grids in surveys. And so in this case, the respondents had to scroll sideways as well as up and down to see all of the options and all of the questions in this question. The optimized version in this case was a carousel, which means we had the question in the top and then the answer options below. And then when the respondent selected an answer option, it would automatically move on to the next question. And then the last optimized versus non-optimized scenario was a picture. As we can see, the one on the right, the optimized one, very nicely fit on the size of the screen, and you could still read what it said on the packaging of this product. On the left, however, it was very small. There was a little zoom button, so if respondents clicked on that, they were able to actually zoom in and see the picture more clearly. However, the original that was presented to them when they got to this question was a small picture, as we can see it on this screen grab. So on the next slide, if you attended last year's webinar, this may sound familiar, because we actually did this same research scenario last year, and we looked at respondent experience, response quality, and respondent behavior. And there were some very interesting findings that came out of this, some of which we wanted to cement and investigate a bit further this year to see whether we could replicate those and whether these were true findings that we as researchers, all of us, need to take into consideration when designing a mobile questionnaire. So the first category was the respondent experience. And last year we found that really there wasn't that much of an impact on survey enjoyment or the likelihood to take another survey or the emotional state that respondents reported pre and post being exposed to our concept test. So neither the optimized nor the non-optimized group really told us that they had a big difference in terms of how much they enjoyed the survey. However, we did find quite interestingly that last year, the abandonment rate in the non-optimized cell was much higher than in the optimized desktop, than in the optimized mobile cell, apologies. So we could see that actually the people who made it through the non-optimized cell were potentially people who were a bit more resilient to clicking through these kinds of non-optimized questions. When it came to response quality, we didn't see a discernible difference between attention check fails or the level of detail of open-ended answers last year. We also did not see that this year. So there was no immediate impact on attention check or the level of detail that we were seeing. However, last year we saw that there was a higher rate of opt-out selected when it came to open-ended questions. So while those people who did reply to the open-ended question gave roughly the same amount of detail in both cells, we did see that in the non-optimized cell, fewer people selected to actually answer the question. So more of them opted out of answering our open-ended questions. Lastly, in the respondent behavior, looking at the list question and the grid question, in the list question last year, we saw that there was no significant difference in terms of the number of options that were chosen between the optimized and the non-optimized list. In the grid question, however, we did see that the options that were not visible on the screen without scrolling were less likely to be chosen. So those answer options that were on the screen were more likely to be chosen than those that the respondents had to scroll for. Very interesting there in terms of behavior. And then in terms of the non-optimized picture, we again saw a higher rate of open-end opt-outs when people were asked to describe something that they saw on this non-optimized picture afterwards. So we saw that the small picture really did have an impact there. So on the next slide, just highlighting the areas that we wanted to have a look at again this year, which were A, the higher survey abandonment, B, the higher rate of opt-outs in open-ended questions, and then C, very interestingly, that change of behavior in the grid question based on what was visible on the screen and what wasn't visible on the screen. And on the next slide, we can see why this is important. Of course, when we think about a higher abandonment rate, so more people dropping out of the survey, that means that needs to be backfilled with more respondents. Every respondent that drops out needs to be replaced with someone who completes, ideally. So that means we're looking at longer fieldwork timelines and possibly increased costs because of increased incentives to keep respondents entering the survey. When we think about, well, who are the people who remain in the survey and who are those more resilient respondents who click through these number of questions that are not very fun to take and to respond to, we need to also think about respondent skews. So is resilience somehow connected to something that may impact the data that we get and collect in our survey? We also have to think about respondent experience. So as we already said in our reflection on the first part of the webinar, respondent experience, we compete for attention. We compete for our respondents' time. So if a respondent has a bad experience, that may make them less likely to spend their time doing research and more likely to spend their time doing something else. And the last point here was the point around data richness, which we observed last year, looking at the higher rate of opt-outs when it came to open-ended questions. So less people who actually wanted to spend the time typing out an answer in an open-ended question. Okay, so one of the really interesting things that we found in the research in 2022 was around the abandonment rate. So what we saw in 2022 was that cell 1, which was the mobile non-optimized cell, had a much higher abandonment rate than cell 2 and cell 3, the mobile optimized and the desktop laptop optimized cells, respectively. And we actually had a look at that again this year, and we saw that this was the case again. So if we look on the left, we can see cell 1 in 2023 had a 22% abandonment rate, which was much higher than the other two cells. And of course, what that leads us to are questions around feasibility and actually finishing a project with an abandonment rate like this. There'll be much more sample that needs to be sent into a study. But of course, it also makes us think about who are the respondents that remain in the survey and that are perhaps more resilient and more motivated to participate. And that may introduce an underlying skew in the data. And what we saw was that the main culprit of abandonment or of causing participants to drop out was, just like in 2022, the image question. So this was a small image question where participants had to click a zoom button to be able to see the picture in an appropriate size. And just like in 2022, in 2023, we saw that 82% of those who dropped out and abandoned the survey actually dropped out at this question. So very interesting takeaway here for us that images and anything that can immediately perceived as not being optimized for the device that respondents are using are a big demotivator for participants and may cause them to drop out of the survey. So the next thing we then looked at on the next slide was all around choosing opt-outs in open-end. So choosing to not write an open-end and instead selecting an option that says, I wish not to answer this question. In 2022, we saw a tendency towards those in the non-optimized cell to choose this option more frequently. So those participants who were in the non-optimized cell more frequently selected they didn't want to provide an open-ended answer to an open-ended question. What we saw in 2023 was that this wasn't necessarily the case. So while in 2022 we saw a much bigger gap, as we see on the right here on the table, there was about a 6-7 percentage point gap. In 2023, this gap was much smaller. So we couldn't necessarily replicate this finding from 2022. The last question that we looked at on the next slide was the grid question. Grids are always an interesting topic when it comes to mobile optimization, and considerations around having an appropriate layout and size for these kinds of questions are very important. So looking at the right, perhaps first have a look at what these questions look like. So in 2022 and in 2023, we had the same setup from a layout perspective. So the non-optimized cell had a classic grid question with lots of options down the side, lots of options in our columns. And in fact, these grids were so big that respondents had to scroll in both scenarios up and down, but also left and right to see the full size of the grid and see all of the answer options on the screen. In the optimized cell, respondents were shown a carousel question. So that means the answer option or the item was at the top, and then the answer options were in the list below and clearly visible on screen. We can see in these small screenshots here already that the optimized version is much easier to see. The grid question is much smaller. One other thing that we changed, though, in 2023 was that we flipped the scale. So this question was, how often do you buy the following items? And then we had a whole list of grocery related items. And in 2022, we asked respondents to use the scale from the most frequent, which was daily, to the least frequent, which was on the very right of the scale. In 2023, we flipped the scale around to test our findings from 2022, which was that those options that were outside of the screen and not visible in the non-optimized scenario were much less likely to be chosen. So we wanted to test this and see whether this wasn't just related to the actual purchase frequency, because some items were just not purchased very often, but that it was actually related to the way that this question was designed and displayed in the survey. So on the next slide, we can see that, in fact, in 2023, we are seeing the same kind of behavior. So on the right in our table, we can see we can see the difference between cell 1, which was non-optimized, and cell 2, which was optimized. And we can see that those options that were shown on the screen were selected much more frequently by the non-optimized cell than by the optimized cell. And those options that were off the screen were selected mostly, with 2 exceptions, were selected less frequently by the non-optimized cell. So we can see, again, this kind of behavior where respondents in the non-optimized cell who were displayed the grid, that what didn't fully fit on the screen, would choose the options on the screen much more frequently than they chose the options off screen. There was one interesting finding here, though. So if we click again, we will see what our green column, our on-screen column, is made up of. We saw that actually the higher on-screen selection was driven quite heavily by once a week. Once a week was chosen much more frequently by respondents in the non-optimized cell with the grid. And the hypothesis here is actually, when we looked at this question on mobile screens, that once a week is the last option that respondents were seeing on the right of their screen before they had to scroll over to see the further options. So actually that once a week was almost like a proxy for the options that they couldn't see off screen. So it was very interesting to see this kind of behavior and how once a week was really driving the selection criteria or selection behavior here in this question. So once again, just bringing home the point from 2022, which is that if options aren't directly visible on screen, there is a tendency for those options that are off screen to be selected less frequently. So summarizing everything then on our next slide, this really leaves us with a clear answer to should surveys be mobile optimized, and that answer is yes. We are seeing that there can be a negative impact on the project's commercials, looking at things like dropout rate and having to replace those respondents. That can of course also bring clear implications for fieldwork timelines and the amount of operational effort that needs to go into running and completing a project. We can also see respondent experience, isn't great when they have to scroll around and possibly drop out of the survey. And also data quality. Again, this brings us back to the point of, are respondents choosing options because those are the options that they want to choose, or is this because the design of the survey is perhaps driving them to reply in a certain way, for example, in the grid question? But also, again, coming back to the dropout rate and thinking about who are the respondents that are left at the end of the survey, if they are more resilient or if they're more patient, for example, and what kind of impact that could have on the representativity of the data. So summarizing this entire section from our topical research on the next slide, we can say, what devices should surveys be offered on? Clearly, at minimum, desktop, laptop, and mobiles. Those are the kind of devices that respondents use most at the moment, but also those are the kind of devices that our device trends are showing there's still innovation happening, and we need to consider things like screen sizes. There is certainly still a lot of work to be done going forward in terms of research and adapting to these different trends. And should surveys be mobile optimized? Yes, they should be. There are clear implications if they aren't. And with that, I will hand back to Deborah.
Thank you for that. And now I was going to ask Keith and Glyn for their reflections on those results. And so, Keith, why don't you start first?
Sure. I think what really stands out to me is the potential impact, on the results. And we were looking at that once a week result, and it was, different by 5 or 6 percentage points. And I think there are a lot of effort goes into these research projects where we want that level of precision. All the time that we spend on the sourcing, all the time that we spend on the quality, And so it seems, like such a misstep to have something happen to your data that is, relatively easy to fix. And this sort of highlights the importance of the discussion today.
And Glyn, what about your perspective on the results that Martina and Marie have just demonstrated?
I think, as Marie has, highlighted, I think the fight for eyeballs and attention from other outlets is a real challenge, and we really need to understand and recognise that, especially for certain demographic groups as well. And I think Keith made the point earlier in the presentation about we need to consider what the respondents' expectations are when we think about survey design. You think about it, just selfishly, what would you expect? I think the first thing is, what's in it for me? Time versus reward doesn't always need to be monetary. The second thing is, how interesting is this topic or survey? And thirdly, how easy is it for me to do that? And I think what we can see with the abandonment rates is it suggests we're not paying enough attention to that respondent experience and meeting their expectations. And that has, quality of data implications. But also from a respondent who's willing to persist under those circumstances when the survey is not optimized for their device. Again, you have to question the motivation and the implications for the richness and the quality of the data they're providing.
Thank you for those reflections, both Keith and Glyn. So I'm now going to ask the panel to turn on to their videos, and so that we can just have a little bit of a discussion about some of the issues that we've been exploring today. So first question I have is, the research is now in its 5th year. So reflecting on the response data over this period, what real progress has been made? And Glyn, can I ask you that question first, and then I'd like to follow up with Keith, because obviously you guys have really looked in detail at this data. It's 5 years. Come on, what have we achieved?
Over the last 5 years, I think the data, if you look at it, it shows that we've seen a 20% point increase in the starts and a higher increase, 25% percentage points on completes since 2018. So, that shows progress, but I think the reality is that the progress was slow to start with. I think we've really only seen an acceleration in the last couple of years. And if you go back to the very first slide that we showed, there's still a material gap between what people are doing in terms of the survey activity. And when you look at their device preference, we see that we're in the mid 50%, which is great. We're ahead of desktop PC for the first time, but we're still, I would say, 20% points difference in what we see in terms of device preference. So more work to be done around design and more work to be done around device controls if we really want to have research which is engaging with the full consumer base that our clients are trying to reach.
And Keith, what's your perspective?
Yeah, certainly agree with that. when we were looking at that gap closing between the starts and completes, that showed some really good progress that we're making. But yeah, to build on what Glyn was saying, the steepness of that curve going all the way back to 2016, where we were at 30% starts about and going all the way up to 70%. What I think about is over that time period in these major markets, it's not as though mobile penetration increased, right? Like these markets were saturated back in 2016. So to me, it does sort of speak to the idea that as an industry, we've really, defaulted to mobile friendly design and we have been able to provide that. But again, there is still evidence that we're not, all the way there yet.
Still some way to go. Marie and Martina, you've obviously been looking a lot at sort of behavior of participants. What are the differences in behavior between the different device types? Did you see any discernible patterns? Can I ask Marie that and then Martina to follow up?
Yes, looking at the grid question, for example, that was a real interesting indicator to how the design of the survey can impact the actual behavior of the respondent, and that can impact the data that comes back at the end of the day. So I think looking at different devices and going back to what Martina said about different screen sizes, for example, mobile isn't isn't equal to mobile. Not every mobile is the same. There are different screen sizes, and there are lots of trends that are going to impact that going forward. So I think that needs to be considered in the testing approach when surveys are being tested and how they're being displayed. But when thinking about behavior, actually, we also have to think about not just mobile optimized versus non-optimized, but thinking about mobile versus desktop. So that's certainly quite an interesting topic for us to explore going forward, to have more of a think about and do some research around what's the behavioral difference of someone taking a survey on a mobile device versus a tablet, for example, or a desktop device. And because of differences in displaying questions, are there any differences in actual survey taking behavior rather than behavior that will influence the responses or the content of the responses? So that is something that we've started looking at a little bit in this data analysis, but we'd definitely like to just do some more in-depth analysis on that. But a very interesting topic.
Martina.
So to me, to build on what Marie was saying, there's definitely some behavioral differences when responding questionnaire when we look at devices. However, what's striking is that the biggest differences are actually, they come down to survey design as a whole. So the difference that we see are not necessarily, people that are completing on mobile versus desktop or laptop, but actually we see more of a consistent behavior when the experience that respondents are going through is seamless, is easy, the questions are all displaying properly. So we kind of need to be careful maybe to talk about responses behavior, because we might not be 100% sure that that's due to the device choice itself, or is a lot to do with questionnaire design, which goes back to how important it is to spend that time to really build your research ahead of going into field. I think that one of the behaviors that, apart from the grid, one of the difference between the group of people that tend to complete on mobile versus the other devices is the level of loyalty to that device of choice. And we've seen that with mobile, but even more so with desktop. There's a group of people that will continue to use desktop. And so it would be good to maybe dig a bit deeper to understand, is there a specific profiling of this group of people, apart from age and gender? What other characteristics can we identify? Habits, lifestyle, speed of technology adoption, all these factors that might actually produce a different response behavior.
That's a very good point. I mean, as I say, reflecting back on the data, on the research, and all the work that is being done, there are still examples of when optimization hasn't been applied. So really, what are the consequences if businesses don't optimize their research for mobile? We've kind of talked a lot about some of the issues, but it'd be really good to kind of get your personal reflections on really what businesses are missing out on by not optimizing their research. Can I start with Keith first, please?
Sure. I think we're at the point in time where there's really the potential for bottom line impact by not having, your survey design that's certainly at least mobile friendly and mobile optimized from there. We saw the feasibility, or at least we saw the amount of traffic that's being driven, especially among younger adults, via mobile. So, if you're at a full service research firm, you're thinking about things like deadlines, timelines. You're thinking about, getting the sample size that you want and you need to have confidence in the results. This certainly has the potential to impact that. I would also add, if we think about the research that's out there that's not masked, which there's a lot of that. I don't always see that, but there is a lot that's happening in the industry, especially, businesses reaching out directly to their customers. If you're not mobile optimized, it does reflect poorly on you, that you're not, meeting the needs of your customers, that you're not that savvy with technology. So I think we are at a point where, it's really, it should have been done before. So if we're not there, we need to get there.
And Glyn, if we're not there, we need to get there. What's your perspective on how this is affecting businesses if they don't optimize?
I mean, just to kind of reiterate what Keith just said, there's sample providers, it becomes increasingly difficult from a feasibility and a deliverability. And then also in terms of being able to retain people on the panel. We've spoken a couple of times about the fact that people are joining panels or wanting to participate in surveys with a mobile or phone device. So it is really difficult, and increasingly so, to be able to support client needs, to support what they're looking to do. I think the other thing for me, which is really important from the client side of this, is the representativity and the quality and the richness of the data they're getting. If you're not designing for all device types, and not just from optimizing mobile, for all devices, you're excluding people from your survey. You're not being able to get the insight from those people that will help you in terms of developing your products or services. So I think it's really important that from a client side, it's that representativity and the quality of their data that they're missing out on.
And Martina, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, we've touched on the commercial impact, low retention rate for panelists, longer fieldwork time. So effectively, everyone is spending more money. But for me, definitely the representativity is probably the key point. And that's not just because of the richness of the data, but also because of the high dropouts. Marie said it many times in her presentation, who are we missing out of? There might be a chunk of the population that we just cannot reach. And so who are those people? And if we can't reach them at all, is what we're doing really representative of that research that we are running?
And Marie, what about your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think summing it up, it's almost, I know we're talking about mobile a lot here, but I think it's almost turning more into device. So, what is the future of survey taking, not just from a mobile versus desktop perspective, but from a device perspective? When we look at the device trends that Martina presented, looking at phones becoming bigger, some laptops becoming smaller, and it's almost we've got tablets somewhere in the middle. So it's becoming a lot more fragmented when we think about things like screen sizes, and also interconnectivity. Internet of Things is something that is already happening, where you can log into an account on your phone and then also log into that same account on your laptop, and you start watching a show on your phone and then you continue where you left off on your laptop. So that interconnectivity of devices, I think, is something that's going to accompany us for the next few years, and that's going to give us quite a few things to think about in terms of research and how we can benefit from those kinds of connections, but also what kind of risks there are, of course. So it almost feels like the direction of travel is not just looking at mobile versus desktop, but at the whole range of devices that people have at their fingertips, and also thinking about how that may differ market to market. So if we think about a mobile first market like India, what innovation there in terms of device types may look very different to innovation around devices in European markets, for example. So I think that'll be quite important for us as researchers to keep an eye on for the next few years.
That's a very good point. So we're drawing to the close with the session today, but we've got enough time for one final question for each of the panelists. And my question is, what is the one recommended takeaway, the one next step from this year's mobile optimization research that you would like to recommend to those listening to this webinar? Martina, what's your one recommended step first?
So my very first top recommendation would be always focus on survey design, regardless of what device you're trying to send a survey to, and look at device agnostic. Focus on device agnostic rather than mobile optimized only. So that's one, and just continue the work that we have been doing. We have answered the questions. We know that surveys have to be mobile optimized. They have to be device agnostic. So let's not drop the ball at any point, because we've come a long way in the last 5-6 years in the industry.
Glyn, what about your piece of wisdom?
Very similar. I mean, I think it's kind of recognizing that technology, as we've all said, is evolving at such a rapid rate. And I think the first question you've got to ask yourself is, what is it you're trying to answer with your research? And who are you trying to reach? And then understanding that technology is evolving, how can you design for all of the different device types that someone may be engaging your survey on, so that they get the best experience possible and you get the best insight possible?
Anne-Marie?
I would say think about the market that you're doing your research in and what kind of technology is available to respondents there. If you run a study in India, as the prime example, only for desktop, you're going to miss out on quite a substantial chunk of the population that's mobile first and perhaps doesn't even own a laptop or desktop. So that can have an impact on the types of respondents that you get and the representativity. So thinking about this in the market context, not just in the global context, just make sure that those individual studies get the representativity and also the traffic from a completion point of view that they need.
And Keith, you get the final word in terms of recommended pieces of wisdom. What's your perspective?
I would just implore all the researchers, especially if you're the survey designer, to take the survey yourself on your mobile device, right? Like, obviously there's a lot of browsers, there's a lot of devices. We have to rely on the technology for proofing. But you as the designer, you have a lot of say, you have a lot of control in what the experience is going to be. And you should want to see the survey, how the majority of the survey takers are going to see it. So I would definitely, recommend that to everyone.
Yes, I often, when I get asked questions about survey design issues, I always sort of say, just imagine your mum taking the survey, and then work out, and then decide whether you think you've done it's gonna hold up. Well, we're now at the end of the webinar, sadly, but it's been fascinating discussion and presentation today. I would like to thank the panelists, Glyn, Martina, Marie, and Keith, for all of their contributions and the support of their companies as well, enabling this information to be collected and analysed each year. This webinar will be available on the MRS website for you to review and to share with colleagues. And if you do have any questions about any of the issues that have been raised today, please do contact MRS via Codeline, which is codeline@mrs.org.uk. And please do look out for the MRS best practice guidelines on mobile optimization, which is based upon this research, which should help you hopefully design better research into the future. Thanks very much, everyone.